Hello everyone, it's Scott and we're back for day 7 of Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. But before we dive into today's spoilers, remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout the rest of Murders at Karlov Manor spoiler season. So let's dive in to today's card. So first we've got Leyline of the Guild Pact for a Selesnya mana, a Simic mana, a Golgari mana, or a Gruul mana. You get an enchantment. And if Leyline of the Guild Pact is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. Each non-land permanent you control is all colors. Lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. So a very interesting card, basically a way to reach the 5 mana requirement for a couple of the cards we've seen so far from the set. And it'll be interesting to see this in combination with some of those, if that together makes it possible for you to, in essence, play those cards in standard. Interesting play design with this, giving you the ability to cast spells with any color of mana that you want. So I can see this immediately being something that the 4 and 5 color control deck might want to have in there, so to giving all their lands all the colors and all their permanents as well. So I think this is definitely going to be standard playable. The question is are we going to have the right deck for it right now? Next we've got Doorkeeper Thrull for 1 and a white mana. You get a Thrull that has flying and is a 1/2 and has flash. And artifacts and creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. So I think this is a potential, certainly a very good sideboard card in white. And I think it can also be main deck because we have a lot of triggered abilities when creatures and artifacts enter the battlefield. And this is going to shut all those down. And particularly this would shut down any of the disguise abilities that are being flipped when you pay the mana and flip your disguised creature. Doorkeeper the Thrull is going to prevent those triggers from occurring. So I think this is definitely standard playable, and the question is going to be what kind of deck is it going to go in. Next we've got Case of the Neglected Feast. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. To solve, you gain 5 or more life this turn. And if it's solved, sacrifice this case. Creature cards in your graveyard gain. You may cast this card from your graveyard until end of turn. So very interesting enchantment case here. Start of it, basically every time a creature comes into play, you gain a life. So solid ability for 1 mana. And then if you can solve it, then in the mid to late game, then you've got that ability after it's solved and you sacrifice it, then to cast any of the creatures you have in your graveyards, which could be a really powerful thing in the late game because you bring back some creatures that you lost over the course of the game, and now they're going to be right there back on the battlefield. So I like this, and I think this is certainly something that decks are going to want to have in it. Next, we've got Lamplight Phoenix for 1 and 2 red mana. You get a Phoenix. It's a 3/3 with flying, and when Lamplight Phoenix dies, you may exile it and collect 4 evidence. If you do, return Lamplight Phoenix to the battlefield tapped to collect evidence 4 exile cards with total mana value 4 or greater from your graveyard. So another one of our Phoenix cards, and this has got a nice re-enter ability where over the course of the game, things have died in terms of other creatures, or you cast some spells, and then when Lamplight Phoenix dies, you can bring it back to the battlefield when you collect that 4 evidence. So I like this card, like the ability on it, and I think it's definitely going to be something that is standard playable. The question is, what deck is going to want the card? Next, we've got Kylox Volt Strider for 1, a blue, and a red mana. You get an artifact vehicle. That's a 4/4. And it has Collect Evidence 6. Kylox Volt Strider becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. And whenever Kylox Volt Strider attacks, you may cast an instant or sorcery spell from among cards exiled with it. if that spell would be put into a graveyard, put it on the bottom of your owner's library instead. So interesting card here. So this has potential to be a really solid, powerful card in Standard. It gives you the ability to replay instants and sorceries you've already used throughout the course of the game. And that can be a really powerful ability in Standard. And you only have to collect evidence one time to get access to those cards, because you can crew it for 2 and use it as a 4/4 using your creatures to crew it rather than collecting evidence. And when you played a few more instants and sorceries, you could use that ability again to collect evidence, and then again to get access to 1 or more of those cards over a couple turns to be able to recast them. And for 3 mana, a relatively inexpensive cost for a 4/4. So I think this has Standard playability. Again, it's going to be, do we have the right deck to support it? And I think, there's been attempts at creating an Izzett spells deck, and I think this is the kind of card that that deck is maybe looking for to put it over the top. Next, we've got Outrageous Robbery. For X and 2 black mana, you get an instant. Target opponent exiles the top X cards of their library face down. You may look at and play those cards for as long as they remain exiled. If you cast a spell this way, you may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast it. So great black theft spell here. You get to take X number of cards off of your top of your opponent's library, and then you get to play those. So it could be, any number of things. It could be creatures, instant sorceries, lands. You get to be able to play those. So I think, a nice card in black. Now the question is there a black deck that would right now that would want this? I'm not sure there is, but it's an interesting enough ability that I think players will try to use it. Certainly, I think it may be sideboardable in some decks. So I'm interested to see where this finds its home in Standard. Next, we've got Forensic Engineer. For 2 and a blue mana. You get a Vidalcan Artificer Detective. That's a 2/3. And whenever you cast an artifact spell, investigate. So this is going to be a creature that's going to go into your dedicated artifact deck. And because it's a dedicated artifact deck, activated abilities of artifacts you control cost 1 less to activate. This effect cannot reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1 mana. So basically, you've got cost reduction for activating your artifact. So whatever the ability of an artifact is, it now is going to cost 1 less. You can't reduce it to 0, but you can reduce it to 1 with this. So I think this is definitely a card that's playable in an artifact deck in Standard. And we've already got one that's beginning to see more and more play. So I think this is going to be one of those that will find a home in Standard. From the last set, we've got all of the artifacts that have craft abilities. So I think this is a great card to go along with those, reducing the craft cost of things. So I'm looking forward to seeing this in Standard. Next, we've got Conspiracy Unraveler. For 5 and 2 blue mana, you get a Sphinx Detective. That's a 6/6 with flying. And an important ability. You may collect evidence 10 rather than pay the mana cost for spells that you cast. To collect evidence 10, exile cards from the top with total mana value 10 or greater from your graveyard. So basically on that turn, you can collect evidence 10, and then anything in your hand you can now cast without having to pay any of its mana cost. So really, really powerful top-end ability. The question is a 7 mana spell good enough for Standard? And right now I don't think it is in blue. Maybe in other colors it might be, but right now we don't have a blue deck that's solid enough to be able to get to that 7 mana. So I think down the road we might see this more in Standard, but right now I think it's just a card that would see some limited playability. Next, we've got Cryptic Coat. For 2 and a blue mana, you get an artifact that's an equipment. And when Cryptic Coat enters the battlefield, cloak the top card of your library, then attach Cryptic Coat to it. Equipped creature gets +1 and can't be blocked. And for 1 and a blue mana, you can return Cryptic Coat to its owner's hand. Then after you return it to your hand, you'd recast it, and then you would go ahead and cloak another card from the top of your library that would then allow you to have it on the battlefield again and make it a 3/2 that can't be blocked. So I think that recursiveness of this is a nice aspect of the spell, but I don't know if this is really standard playable. Given it a 3/2 that's unblockable, it's nice, but it seems to me like it's just going to be the target of removal. Things like cut down can kill the card. So as a result of that, I'm not really sure this has a place in standard. Next, we've got our first lower rarity card of the day, and that's Hard Hitting Question. For a green mana, you get a sorcery. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. Very powerful removal here in green, and this, in my mind, will help green decks be able to compete more in standard, because the ability to have one of your green creatures basically deal damage to one of your opponent's creatures and kill it is a very powerful ability. So I can see this main deck in green decks, because you're going to have the ability with green, because we know right now a lot of the green creatures are overpowered in terms of power and toughness, but we haven't really gotten to that point where we've got a true mono green stompy kind of deck out there. But I think this is a kind of card that deck's going to want, and other green decks are going to want as well, as a way of taking out your opponent's creatures. Next, we've got Case of the Gateway Express. For 1 and a white mana, when this case enters the battlefield, choose target creature you don't control. Each creature you control deals 1 damage to that creature. So an interesting removal spell at the beginning of the case. So, if you're playing an aggro deck and you want to be able to basically kill any creature that comes into play on your opponent's side, this is a great little spell for that, because typically you've got 4 or 5 creatures on the field in those aggressive white strategies out there right now. So I think this can pretty much kill almost anything on your opponent's side of the battlefield, given the fact that you're likely to have those 4, 5, 6, 7 creatures at different times. And that can be game changing, because you can take out their biggest threat to your ability to go ahead and attack in and end the game. Now, to solve this, you have to attack with 3 or more creatures. So the turn that it comes into play, probably you kill the opponent's best creature, then you attack with 3 or more of your creatures, and then you get it solved. And then once it's solved, creatures you control get +1/+0. So I think this is an easily one of the best cases we've seen so far, because I think on one turn you'll be able to attack to solve it, and then after that you get the benefit of that +1/+0 for all of your creatures. Next, we've got Curious Inquiry. For a blue mana, you get an enchantment that's an aura. Enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1, and has, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you get to investigate. So we've seen abilities like this before, but it's usually you get to draw a card and then you get to discard a card. So this is a little bit different in the sense that now you're going to have to make it a mana commitment to it. But in a deck that would want those investigate clues, I think this is a really nice card in those decks. So it's low mana cost. You attach it to your 1/1 flyer. Now it's a 2/2. It's going to deal some combat damage. You're going to get to investigate a number of times, creating a number of clue tokens that then later in the game you can use to either draw a card or use for another effect in standard. So I think this is definitely a standard playable card. Next, we've got some of our lower rarity stuff that I think for the most part is going to be stuff that we're going to see in limited. So I want to go through them quickly, just kind of get you familiar with what they are. So we have another case, the case of the Shattered Pact. And when this case enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. So nice ability. Hey, 2 mana, go get a basic land. Okay. To solve it then, there are 5 colors among permanents you control. So that's the part of it that I think is going to be difficult. Now, maybe the Leyline of the Guild Pack along with this work together to get you there, because you could have a 4 or 5 color deck as a result of that. But we'll have to see if that really works in combination. Now, if you are able to solve it at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gains flying, double strike, vigilance, until the end of turn. So a powerful ability if you're able to solve it, but I think for the most part this is not really going to be standard playable because you've got to jump through a lot of hoops to get to that 5 colors among permanents you control. Next we've got Griffin Knot Tracker for 3 and a white mana. You get a Human Detective. That's a 3/2 with flying. When Griffin Knot Tracker enters the battlefield, exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard. Okay, definitely limited playable. A 4 mana for a 3/2 flyer. We've seen that before. And that ability to go ahead and remove some target things, 2 target cards from a graveyard could be helpful in limited. Next, we've got Neighborhood Guardian for 1 and a white mana. You get a Unicorn, that's a 2/2. And whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, target creature you control gets +1/+1 until the end of turn. So I think this has potentially, if the cards that we're seeing in these lower rarities, standard playability, because already in white we've got a number of shells that are 2 mana or less, 2 power or less creatures that you're trying to flood the board with. So this would be a payoff for playing those cards and boosting 1 or more of your cards throughout the course of a turn. Next, we've got Agency Outfitter for 4 and 2 blue mana. You get a Sphinx Detective. That's a 4/3. And it has flying. And when Agency Outfitter enters the battlefield, you may search your library, your hand, or your graveyard for a card named Magnifying Glass and or a card named Thinking Cap and put them onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle. So this is one of those cards that you're looking to execute a game plan to get your Magnifying Glass, to get your Thinking Cap, to then use those in the game. So probably not even, it's a decent card in limited because it's a 4/3 flyer, but you would have to have Magnifying Glass, you'd have to have Thinking Cap to actually make this work. So in a deck that's going to want to use all 3 of those spells together, it might have some standard playability, but outside of that it probably doesn't have a place in standard. Next we've got Behind the Mask for a blue mana. You get an instant. As an initial cost to cast the spell, you may collect Evidence 6. Until end of turn, target artifact or creature becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 4/3. If evidence was collected, it has base power and toughness 1/1 until end of turn. So this is an offensive and a defensive spell. So on the offensive side of it, you just play it and you create a 4/3 for that turn. Okay, not a problem. Maybe make one of your clue tokens at 4/3, but also you could at instant speed, if you can collect Evidence 6, then you turn one of your opponent's creatures into a 1/1 until the end of turn, which should allow you to block it and take it out in combat. So a nice little combat trick, certainly a card that you'd want to use in limited. Next we've got Candlestick for a blue mana. You get a clue equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has, whenever this creature attacks, Surveil 2. And for 2 mana you can sacrifice Candlestick to draw a card, and its equip is 2. So nice little ability, goes down the murder at Karlov Manor theme with the clue idea here, but probably not really standard playable, but a decent card in limited. Next we've got Eliminate the Impossible for a blue mana and 1. You get an instant and you get to investigate, and creatures your opponent controls get -2, -0 until end of turn. If any of those creatures were suspected, they no longer are suspected. So I think this is potentially a standard playable card in your sideboard if you're playing blue. And the reason for that is, A, you get to investigate, you get that benefit, but also then all of your opponent's creatures get -2. And in combat, that might be just what it takes for your side to win that trade, that battle, and your opponent to lose it. So I think this is, if you're looking at it as a sideboard card, this is something to put in the sideboard, so that if you're playing with one of those against one of those go wide creature decks, you've got the ability to basically take out a lot of those creatures' ability to deal combat damage that turn. And if there are cards that are suspected on your opponent's side, no longer do they have menace, and as a result of that, it'll be easier to block them. And again, that can create some miscalculations in combat that would benefit you. So I like this card as a sideboard option in Standard, and certainly a card that I would want to have in Limited. Next, we've got Izzett Specialist for 1 and a blue mana. You get a Human Detective, that's a 2/1. An Izzett Specialist cannot be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. So nice ability to make it a little bit more difficult for your opponent to block. If it gets blocked, it's likely to trade with that creature, or more likely to trade with that creature than it would otherwise, so that's helpful. Now, it also has Disguise, where you can pay 3 mana, make it a 2/2 with Ward 2, and then its Disguise cost is 1 and a blue mana, and you can flip it, and when Izzett Specialist is turned face up, return another target creature to its owner's hand. So that means in the mid to late game, you can flip this up, and the best creature your opponent has, you can send it back to their hand. And again, that might be something in combat that you would do, and that could change the face of that particular combat and possibly even win you the game. Next, we've got Living Conundrum for 4 and a blue mana. You get an Elemental, that's a 2/5 with Hexproof. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, skip that draw instead. So interesting ability that allows you to, basically drain your library and not have to lose a game because of that. And as long as there are no cards in your library, Living Conundrum has base power and toughness 10/10, and has flying and vigilance. So this is really like a payoff for you emptying your library. Now this creature has flying, it has vigilance, and hopefully you can attack over and win the game at that point. Now, is this Standard playable? I don't think so. There's just too many things that would have to happen to get you to that 10/10 creature for you to be able to win the game. Limited, it's probably going to be a pretty powerful card in that format because you're more likely to be able to drain out your deck in Limited than you would be in Standard. Next, we've got Surveillance Monitor for 3 and a blue mana. You get a Vidalcan Detective. That's a 3/3. And when Surveillance Monitor enters the battlefield, you may collect evidence 4. Whenever you collect evidence, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. Now, the nice thing on this one, and this is, I think, certainly one where, when it comes in the battlefield, you can create that 1/1 Thopter at that point, but any other cards you've got in your deck that have collect evidence as a part of the cost, you can pay those costs, and then Surveillance Monitor is going to give you another 1/1 Thopter artifact creature token when that happens. So if there was a deck that was centered around collecting evidence, this would be a very good card in that. Certainly in Limited, I think this is a solid card to have because in essence it can get you 2 bodies onto the field, and one of those would be evasive. So I think in that setting, it's a good card for Limited. Next, we've got some black cards for the day. First is Ally Assailant for 2 and a black mana. You get a Vampire Rogue. That's a 3/3. And Ally Assailant enters the battlefield tapped. And it has Disguise, so you can pay 3 mana, make it a 2/2 with Ward 2. And its Disguise cost is 6, so very high cost for that. And when Ally Assailant is turned face up, target opponent loses 3 life, and you gain 3 life. So basically 6 mana for you to gain 3 life, and your opponent to lose 3 life. So I think that's probably too much even for Limited, so I don't think that ability will be used very often. You're better off with a 3/3 most of the time. Next, we have Rot Farm Mortipede for 3 and a black mana. You get an insect, that's a 3/4. And whenever 1 or more creature cards leaves your graveyard, Rot Farm Mortipede gets +1 and gains menace and lifelink until end of turn. So I think a very good Limited card. You use one of your collect evidence cards to collect that evidence, you give it +1, and then you get the menace and the lifelink until end of turn. And that's a pretty solid card in Limited. Probably not much Standard playability because you would have to be removing creatures consistently to be able to activate the +1/+0 ability and gain that menace and the lifelink. Next, we've got some red cards for the day. First is Caught Red-Handed. For 4 and a red mana, you get an instant, and this spell cannot be countered. Gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature. It gains haste until end of turn, and suspect it. So you're going to gain control of a creature, you get to suspect it, and then hopefully you've got some way of getting rid of the creature on your side by sacrificing it to one of your abilities. So I think because it's 5 mana, it has a little playability in limited, but I don't see this as having really any standard playability because we've got these active treason spells already in standard for like 3 mana, and we don't see them played very often. Alright, next we've got Frantic Scapegoat. For 1 red mana, you get a goat with haste. That's a 1/1. And when Frantic Scapegoat enters the battlefield, suspect it. Thus giving it menace, and it can't block. And it's a 1/1 anyways, you're probably not going to block with it at any point, regardless. And whenever 1 or more other creatures enter the battlefield under your control, if Frantic Scapegoat is suspected, you may suspect 1 of the other creatures. If you do, Frantic Scapegoat is no longer suspected. So you have the ability to transfer that suspectability to one of your other creatures. So I think certainly in limited, this is a great card. You know, because you get that early haste ability, getting some quick damage. And then later in the game, you can transfer that suspectability to something better to force your opponent to have to block with 2 creatures to be able to counter that attack. Next, we've got Offender at Large. For 4 and a red mana, you get a Giant Rogue. That's a 5/4. It has Disguise for 4 and a red mana, and when Offender at Large enters the battlefield or is turned face up to 1 target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Okay, definitely a limited playable card, but outside of that, not going to see much play. Next, we've got Torch the Witness. For X and a red mana. Torch the Witness deals twice X damage to target creature. If excess damage was dealt to that creature this way, investigate. Basically, it's a scalable removal spell where you can kill something for 2 mana, you know, or you can put 3 mana to do 4 damage, 3 mana in it to do 6 damage. So I think it has definitely limited playability. This is going to be a card you're going to want in limited. And maybe this sees some sideboard play in standard because you are going to need some things to deal with large creatures on your opponent's side, and this would do that for you. Next, we've got Flourishing Bloomkin. For 1 and a green mana, you get a plant elemental. It's a 0/0, and Flourishing Blossomkin gets +1/+1 for each forest you control. It has Disguise 4 and a green mana. And when Flourishing Blossom King is turned face up, search your library for up to 2 forest cards and reveal them. Put 1 of them onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, and then shuffle. So if you do go ahead and disguise this for 3 mana, making it a 2/2, then as the game progresses, you get to that point where you got 5 mana, you can flip it, and now you can go ahead and get 2 forests, 1 to put on the battlefield, 1 to put in your hand, and continue to grow your Flourishing Bloomkin. And we've got other cards that are similar to this in standard that have similar abilities, but they're really not seeing much play. So I think in a dedicated green deck, this could be a great card, but we really don't have a dedicated green deck right now in standard, and because of that, I don't think it's going to see much play. Very good card potentially, though, in limited, because it's a card that can grow itself consistently over the course of a game. Next, we've got Rubble Belt Maverick. For a green mana, you get a Human Detective. That's a 1/1. And when Rubble Belt Maverick enters the battlefield, you get to Surveil 2. So definitely a good card in limited. That surveillability is nice. You look at the top 2 cards of your library, and you can either leave them there or put them in your graveyard. And then for a green mana, you can exile Rumblebelt Maverick from your graveyard to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. You can only activate that as a sorcery. So this would be a 1-drop in limited I'd be looking for, because I think it's a very good limited card because it gives you some ability to shape the top of your library. And then when it dies, it actually gives you some additional value by being able to put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature. All right, now to our multicolored spells for the day. First, we've got Evidence Examiner for a blue and a green mana. You get a Merfolk Detective. That's a 2/2. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may collect evidence 4. Whenever you collect evidence, investigate. So you can collect evidence 4. You can create a clue token that you can later crack to go ahead and draw a card. So in limited, I think this is definitely a playable card. If we get a dedicated Merfolk deck that wants this kind of ability, then I can see it potentially going in there as well. Otherwise, I don't see it seeing much standard play. Next, we've got Riftburst Hellion for 5, a red and a green mana. You get a creature that's a Hellion. It's 6/7 and it has reach. And it has Disguise, so early in the game you can pay it for that 3 mana. It has Disguise for 4 and 2 hybrid Gruul mana. So in the early game, I think this is definitely something that you could play for its Disguise cost, and then later in the game, when you've got your 6 mana, then you turn it face up, and it becomes a very powerful card on the board. So very much a card I'd like to see played in limited. Next, we've got our last 2 cards of the day. The first is Soul Search for a white and a black mana. You get a sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. Exile that card. If that card's mana value is 1 or less, create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. So this is one of those cards that, it's a nice card early in the game. You kind of get to take a card out of your opponent's hand, but we already have creatures and or spells like Duress, and we've got a number of other spells that do the same thing. So I'm not sure that paying a white and a black mana to do this is really better. But if you're taking a 1 mana or less spell, you do get the benefit of creating that 1/1 white and black spirit creature token. So if we see a lot of decks that are really playing a lot of 1-cost spells, then it might have some playability in standard. Certainly a little bit of limited playability for sure, because you'll want to be able to take cards out of your opponent's hand. All right, our last card of the day is Lumbering Laundry. For 5, you get an artifact creature. That's a golem. It's a 4/5. It has pay 2 until end of turn. You may look at face down creatures you don't control anytime. So this, for 2 mana, it allows you to look at all of the cloaked and disguised cards on the field. It also has Disguise of 5, so you could play it on turn 3 for its disguise cost, and then later flip it and get access to that ability. All right, that's day 7 of Murders at Karlov Manor. So a lot of cards today, mostly things that we're going to see in limited, but we did get some interesting rares and mythics from the set today, and we'll be back tomorrow with more of Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at them already, here are the last couple days spoilers from over the weekend for you to take a look at. All right, thanks for watching until the end of the video, and I'll see you next time.